Well, it's certainly easier to prepare these Morning Pitt episodes when, there's a story, when there's news, when there's something significant to talk about. Yesterday, we had to dig in a little bit and talk about Pitt recruiting the Whippeal. Today, not so much, as the news came yesterday that Jaylen Lowe is entering the transfer portal. A move that was speculated upon, guessed at, hinted at, suggested, assumed, any number of ways you could put it, that people have sort of thought this might happen or thought this would happen since the end of the season, and maybe even earlier. Once Jai Lucas got the Miami job, or even was linked to the Miami job, people started talking about the possibility that Jaylen Lowe might go into the transfer portal, and then the news came out yesterday that he was doing it, that he's leaving Pitt after 2 seasons, leaving Jeff Capel, a family connection with Capel, something that had been talked about a lot during Lowe's 2 seasons at Pitt. But family connections don't count for a whole lot. Personal connections don't count for a whole lot. Relationships, this is not a relationship business anymore. Coaches can try and tell you that it's still a relationship business. It's not a relationship business anymore. We're not going to sit here and bash Jaylen Lowe for making the decision that he made. He made the same decision that literally thousands of other college basketball players have made this offseason, not to mention college football players. Thousands of players have made this same decision that Jaylen Lowe made, and I'm sure all of those players had connections with their head coaches and connections with their teams and their, brotherhood and city and all that stuff. And they still made the decision to go into the transfer portal. And there's a lot of reasons to do that. Certainly money is a primary motivating factor, but there's a lot of things that can go into it. And I think if you're Jaylen Lowe, this season was probably pretty tough. This was probably not an easy season for you to get through, not just on a personal level and on a team level, because this season was a pretty significant disappointment for everyone involved. I think of how Pitt basketball went. I don't think there's anybody involved in that program who feels good about how this season went. And certainly Jaylen Lowe will be among that group. Now, we could get into questions about motivation. Oh, if you felt like this was a bad year, you should be part of rebuilding for next year or whatever. It's the transfer portal. It's college sports in 2025. And it's going to get worse before it gets better if it's not already to the point of worse. It's how it goes. And I don't think, I think we are all well past the point of surprises. I would say that anyone who follows Pitt sports should have moved past the point of being surprised by anything, probably around 3 years ago at this time, in the spring of 2022, when Jordan Addison went into the transfer portal. That, and I've said this a bunch of times, that should have been the one that fully opened your eyes. It fully opened my eyes of like, holy crap, anybody can go. Anybody can go. There's nothing that connects anyone to any of these programs. If a kid wants to go, if a kid has an opportunity to get money, if a kid has an opportunity to get paid more elsewhere, he can and will go. And so we shouldn't be surprised by any of these things. And certainly I don't think anyone is really truly shocked by Jaylen Lowe. So we're not going to spend too much time talking about, wow, the big surprise of it, because I don't think there is a huge surprise to it. Jaylen Lowe did what college student athletes are doing. He went to the portal, and he's going to probably land at somewhere, a power conference program, probably do well, might be in the ACC. Wouldn't be surprised if he lands at Miami or someplace like that, or maybe he ends up in the SEC. But wherever he goes, he's probably going to do well because he's a talented basketball player. So let's talk about what Pitt is losing with Jaylen Lowe, what Pitt needs, how they're going to replace Jaylen Lowe, and kind of where they stand now. There's only 4 scholarship guys left who haven't announced their decisions on what they're doing. I'm taping this yesterday afternoon. I'm taping this Tuesday afternoon, so fingers crossed that we don't have to re-edit that number and more guys make their announcements tonight. But Jaylen Lowe is gone. He's going to the transfer portal. What is Pitt losing? What did Lowe offer to Pitt this year? What did they get out of him? What did they need out of him? And what do they need to do? What's it going to look like next year? What does a Pitt basketball roster without Jaylen Lowe look like in the 2025-26 season? We got a lot to talk about with Jaylen Lowe, his decision to go into the portal, and what it means for the Pitt Hoops program right here on the Morning Pitt, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. So I'll start off by saying, like this video and subscribe to youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com, because it's what I always have to start off by saying. But I'll start off by saying, as much as any of us can know these guys yeah, I mean, like media or fans, whatever kind of interactions you have with these student athletes. And, for me, it's, doing interviews and that kind of thing, press conferences. For you as a fan, maybe it's in an autograph line or you run into them at Chipotle or something like that. Like we don't really know these guys. We watch them play sports. We see the interviews. We try and get a sense of who we think they are, but a lot of it is just sort of informed by our assumptions based on limited glances, little snapshots of these people. And so I can't say that I really know Jaylen Lowe or knew Jaylen Lowe, but I would say that my interactions with him were always pleasant. He always seemed like a nice kid, a good kid. He came out and talked. I forget when, we talked to him after one of the losses late in the season. I mean, he was a stand-up guy about it. I mean, I think his emotion after the Notre Dame game was genuine. I think he, really was crushed by this loss. Even if he was already entertaining notions of going into the transfer portal, I think he, in the moment, he's still playing with his team. He's playing with his, Pitt brothers. He's playing with his Pitt family, and they just had a really brutal, difficult loss. And so, I think all of that's real and sincere. And so I think he is he seems like a good kid. He seems like a nice kid. Like I say, I always had good interactions, never got any sense of him having an inflated opinion of himself or anything like that. But for whatever that's worth, and it's probably not a lot, because what do we really know? We get to know these guys in little, highly controlled, almost sterilized snapshots. It's not a full picture of who the person is. All that aside, because it doesn't matter about who they are. I mean, we wish him well, and I don't think he leaves behind any bad blood, at least as far as I know. Maybe we'll find out in the next few weeks that he does, but wish him well. Sure, he'll find a good opportunity to play basketball, but I think it's more interesting and more relevant for us to talk about what he did at Pitt this season. And Jaylen Lowe, by the end of the year, was a pretty significant lightning rod. Certainly not the only one, but when you started listing the reasons of why Pitt had the season they had and why they weren't as good as they were expected to be, why they went 3-15, or what was it, 5-13 down the stretch or something like that? Yeah, 5-13 down the stretch. His name was right near the top. It might not have been the number one name on the list, but it was right near the top of, reasons the team struggled. Right up there with Jeff Capel and Cam Corrin. And it all kind of it flows together there, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Jaylen Lowe's final season at Pitt this past year, he averaged 16.8 points per game, 5.5 assists per game, and 3 turnovers per game. And that's probably the number to start with, is that 3 turnovers per game, particularly when you put it next to the 5.5 assists per game. I mean, that's it's worse than a 2-to-1 ratio, right, of assists to turnovers. And so right there, you're starting to see some of the problems. He also, in 32 games, had 3 or more turnovers 20 times. So a majority of his games, he committed 3 or more turnovers. Now, you say 3 turnovers in a game, that's not a god-awful, terrible number, but it's not good. It's not as good as it needs to be if you're going to be a team's primary point guard, top playmaker, the guy who has the ball in his hands every possession, and the guy who's expected to distribute and set up his teammates and help run things. If you're committing 3 or more turnovers 20 out of 32 games, what's the math on that? 5 out of 8? What's the percentages? It doesn't matter. It's not good enough. That's a big problem. That's a big part of the problem. When this offense would go stagnant, when this offense was struggling, those turnovers were a big part of the reason why, when they would fall into these deep holes in the first half so many times that we talked about so often, big part of it was the turnovers. Big part of it was the scoring droughts. And the scoring droughts really stem from 2 places. 1, turnovers, and 2, missed shots. Obviously, if you're not scoring, guess what's happening? You're turning the ball over and you're missing shots. And that was the other part of the issue with Jaylen Lowe. Too many forced shots, too many poor decisions with the shot. Now, I think to some extent, Jaylen Lowe felt like he had to take those shots. He had to be the one to try to make every play, because sometimes, depending on the lineup on the court, he was the one who had to make every play. And we talked at length throughout the season about how there were guys open. They should have distributed more. Jaylen Lowe and Ishmael Leggett, when they drive, they need to be able to kick out because there's shooters on the outside. Zach Austin was shooting well at that point. Guillermo Diaz-Graham could shoot well. Or even when Amsal Delilich or Brandon Cummings would be in the game, those guys were available as shooters. And all too often it felt like Lowe and Leggett were trying to drive or force something or buy contact or initiate contact and buy a foul rather than kick out to the open shooters who maybe could knock down the shot and give the offense a boost. And that was a problem. And so it was those two things, and they're not entirely unrelated, turnovers and sort of forcing bad shots and bad decisions, but I think you need to look a little bit more at the root cause, because it's not only relevant to discussing Jaylen Lowe and his time at Pitt, and certainly his final season at Pitt, but it's also relevant to discussing what this team needs to be going forward. Why did Jaylen Lowe feel like he needed to play that way? Why did Jaylen Lowe feel like he needed to take some of those shots, fire up those shots? You remember the Georgia Tech game? He had, but I had his game-by-game stats here. Let me see if I can find that Georgia Tech game where I'll sort by points, because he scored 25 points in that game, but he was 7 of 21 from the field. Shot under 40%. He shot 33.3%. He was 2 of 9 from 3 in that game. And Damon Stoudemire said it after the game. He was like, Lowe had 25 points, and I think Ishmael Leggett was in the 20s as well, but they both took a ton of shots. And he said, Lowe had 25 points, but they weren't impactful points. They weren't dynamic points. And he considered it a win. Not the fact that Jaylen Lowe scored 25, but that he took 21 shots to do it, that he was 2 of 9 from 3, and that they largely kept Guillermo Diaz-Graham and Zach Austin contained in that game. And that was, one of Pitt's bad losses. They ended up losing that game by 6 at home. It was one in a long series of bad losses, but that was certainly one of them. And you have this high volume of shooting. Why did Jaylen Lowe shoot like that? Why did Jaylen Lowe play like that? Why did he go from the player he was in his freshman season when, eventually he got in, he started 19 games and he shot 38.8% from the field, 35% from 3. He averaged 3.3 assists and 1.4 turnovers per game. So he was better than 2-to-1 ratio. What changed there? Only 9.6 points per game, but he was, he wasn't getting more assists. He averaged more assists per game this year, but he was playing less last year. But what changed? And I think there's a few factors. And one, not the least of which, and not the least important, I should say, is the surrounding cast. Because Jaylen Lowe as a freshman had Bub Carrington, he had Ishmael Leggett, and he had Blake Hinson. Jaylen Lowe as a sophomore had Ishmael Leggett. And that's a pretty big difference. I mean, Damian Dunn, for some of the games, but not even half, because he missed all that time due to injury. But there was no other guard, and there was no three-point shooting threat like Blake Hinson. Zach Austin was not going to fill either of those roles, either the Bub Carrington role, which obviously he's not going to fill, or the Blake Hinson role, despite his three-point shooting. We talked about this a lot during the season. Zach Austin wasn't and was never going to be a focal point of the offense. You weren't going to run your offense through Zach Austin. His points were going to come in different ways. He was going to score, and he shot better this year than he had in the past, or certainly better than he did his first year at Pitt. But it was not the same kind of thing. It was not the same kind of weapon to be surrounded by, and not the same kind of player who's going to draw attention away the way Blake Hinson did. And so it was a very different type of team 2 years ago when Jaylen Lowe was a freshman, when he showed all that promise, when he showed how well he could play with a strong surrounding cast. And it's not like, I'm not damning with faint praise here. I'm not saying, Lowe, when you take away Carrington and Hinson, he's just an average player. No, he's a guy who tried to take too much on himself. He's a guy who tried to do too much himself. And the result was this remarkably inefficient season where he shot 37.6% from the field. He shot 26.6% from 3. He was a legitimately bad shooter, and his three-point shooting hurt the team. I mean, it legitimately hurt the team. And that's a big difference between the 2 years. Lowe is capable of being that player he was in his freshman year. But when he had and felt like he had to take everything on himself, and he wasn't entirely wrong about that, but when he felt like he had to take everything on himself, his efficiency dropped, the turnovers went up, the shooting went down, and he became, quite frankly, a much worse player. And this is important. I think it's important to understand in terms of Jaylen Lowe's legacy. I think it's important to understand in terms of placing Jaylen Lowe's sophomore season in context. And I think it's important to understand in terms of what Pitt needs to do for next year. Obviously, they need a point guard. They've got Brandon Cummings coming back, and he could be a point guard, but I think he might be better off the ball. So you need a point guard. And even if you do think Brandon Cummings can be your one, you need guys. You need guards to come in and fill out this roster, because as it stands right now, in case you've forgotten, as of Tuesday afternoon, they've got 4 scholarship players slated to come back. Brandon Cummings, who we are, pretty close to 100% confident he's going to come back. And I only say pretty close because I hesitate to guarantee anything, but I would say it certainly looks like it. They've got Cam Corrin, who has not announced that he's going somewhere else. Papa Amadou Kanti and Amni Najai. That's it. Those 4 players last season combined to average 19.7 points per game. So your returning scholarship roster averaged less than 20 points per game this past season. Now, some of those numbers are going to go up. Brandon Cummings playing a full workload for a full season is going to do better than 6.3 points per game. Papa Amadou Kanti should play enough to average more than 2.1 points per game. Amni Najai, a pretty smart person that I know who I trust and value their opinion, said this could be a secret weapon here, be a surprise breakout player for next season. And so I'll take his word for that, and we'll keep an eye on it. But he's a guy who's going to play on like the wing. He's not going to be a point guard. So you're going to need someone to step in there, but it's relevant to think about what Lowe's sophomore season was with the cast of characters around him, and then really think of those 2 years, of Lowe's 2 seasons, as you try to put together a roster for this coming season. In terms of roster construction, I think it's pretty instructive and informative to think about those 2 teams, because you can't go into next year without putting some solid talent around like Brandon Cummings and whoever your transfer point guard is. And I think you need a transfer point guard, but you also need 3-point shooting. You also need a power forward. You need guys who are going to be able to play in these spots, and you need to be able. I don't think. Look, there are point guards out there who can just be the man and they can take over without any talent around them, but you're going to need to surround these guys with legitimate threats. Brandon Cummings is going to have to take a huge step forward for next season. Of course, he's going to be counted on to play a really significant role. We'll see what they want to do with the center position. I don't want to say it's hard to believe they would just run it back with Cam Corrin and Papa Amadou Kanti again, but because it's not hard to believe that. It's just at times a little hard to stomach it. The thought of that. But I mean, that's sort of what it looks like they're going to do, unless Corrin pulls a surprise move here and announces he's going into the transfer portal. And so you need to build a roster that in some ways is constructed like that roster 2 years ago. Now, most teams are not going to have a Blake, and so you're not going to go try and find another Blake, but you do need legitimate 3-point shooting. You need a legitimate 3-point shooting threat aside from just Brandon Cummings, who I think is a really good shooter. You need more than just that. And then you need a point guard. You need more wings. You need a power forward. You need some backup guards. The list of needs is not a short one. But looking at the last 2 rosters and what worked 2 years ago and what didn't work this past year, it's pretty helpful, I think. It should lay out a bit of a blueprint for what the staff can do and wants to do in the transfer portal this offseason heading into this coming season. For now, all we know is that Jaylen Lowe is gone. You would like to think that now that he has made this decision, some of the other wheels can start turning, right? Like, that your budget is not going to be eaten up with a significant chunk going to him. So some of the other wheels can start moving a little bit, and maybe things can start happening in terms of getting guys, contacting guys, bringing guys in for visits, and getting the transfer portal really kind of hopping for Pitt. You have a much clearer idea of what you need, and you have a much clearer idea of how much you have available to spend on them. So can get started on that. And would like to see a little movement, little action out of the Pitt staff here coming up soon. All right, we'll be keeping an eye on it, covering it all at Panther-Lair.com. So make sure you check out the website, Panther-Lair.com. And, of course, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. That way you don't miss any of our Pitt video content. We'll be live tonight for the Panther-Lair show at 8:30 right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. So make sure you tune in for that. Me and Jim Hammett will be talking to you about Pitt sports. You can put in your comments and questions. We'll have a good conversation. So come and hang out. Do that. We look forward to it. All right. Thanks so much for checking out the show today. Make sure you like and subscribe. Have a good Wednesday. We'll talk to you tonight for the live Panther-Lair show, and we'll catch up with you tomorrow for the Morning Pitt right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.